with about a $324 million shortfall on what was labeled as shared responsibility. The mayor's office thought that they would be able to get over $300 million of givebacks from the union. Much of that givebacks did not occur. So if you go back and think about tracking how we got here, is that probably you can zero in on a couple of issues. One, in the mid-90s, when the city was flush with cash, particularly with .com and a variety of windfall dollars. Instead of putting money away for infrastructure and for stabilization of the budget, it was spent on people. And once those dollars disappeared, the process and the dollars continued as it relates to the allocation. The other thing that has hurt the city most recently is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate has driven many of our primary dollars down. If you can't work, you can't buy, business can't prosper, you can't pay your rent, you get foreclosed on. All of these are our primary dollars of property tax, sales tax, business tax. These are all the things that where an unemployment rate significantly impairs the ability of the city to address these revenue issues. And so as we move forward, the things that we have to be able to be concerned about is we must address the pension issue, we must address the medical plan issue. We have had a 100% increase in the cost of medical in the last 10 years. And the issues that you go forward on, you cannot afford to sustain that. Just from workers' comp and medical and pension, those three issues alone will bankrupt the city if they do not make some drastic changes in all three. So that's how we got here. The issue is how do we move forward? How do we come up with some strategic plans so that if funds come in and there's a windfall, we don't make the same mistakes we made 10 years ago, 7 years ago, 3 years ago, that we invest the money, we put it into our stabilization account, we invest in our infrastructure, but that we do things in a manner in which we do not replicate the errors of the past.
I'm going to start asking questions that are targeted to individual panelists just so we can get through a few more questions, and also if someone violently disagrees with what another panelist said, then let me know and jump in. But I want to pose a question to Wendy Gruhl. Now that this budget has passed, do you think that layoffs and furloughs can be avoided without concessions from city workers? And when I say concessions, I don't mean ideas from the coalition of LA city unions, but literally either they contribute more toward their pension benefits, or contribute more toward healthcare, or take some kind of cut. Do you think, knowing what you know now about the budget, that those can be avoided without those concessions?
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not on the council and the ERC, and I know that there are discussions. Mr. Park serves on that particular committee. They met this morning. I know that the city administrative officer is working and negotiating with the labor unions to see where there are concessions potentially that could help balance that budget to be able to meet those needs. Right now, again, with the knowledge I have, and I'm not at the table, I believe to avoid any, there is going to have to be some agreement, either new funding source or concessions to meet that need.
Okay. Paul, do you have a violent disagreement?
I have probably a slight disagreement. I'm somewhat skeptical that we can close the gap without some significant concessions, but I don't care how we save the money. If labor suggests some efficiencies and cost savings, and that's part of how we close the gap, I'm perfectly happy, and in fact, that's been my goal all along. And some of the efficiencies that we've put forward have come from our labor unions. One of the ones that I championed most aggressively, but was suggested to me by labor unions, was we've cut in various ways our city employees, but we have hundreds of millions of dollars in outside contracts, and their employees are doing just fine. So I said, well, why not have them contribute a little bit as well? Why not ask all of our outside contractors to contribute 10% voluntarily and take that as a cut to their contracts? Well, some of them, we sent out letters, we contacted some of them, and a lot of them said yes. Some have worked with the city attorney's office and given back more than 10%. Some have said we don't have the margin, we'll give 5%. Some have said, well, the hell with you, we don't have to give back anything. But when you add it all up, my guess is it could be as much as could be as much as $20 million or more this coming year. And that's just one idea. It came from labor. So if we were $60 million short at that time when we saved $20 million and we're only $40 million short, well, a savings is a savings. But I have no doubt for us to avoid layoffs, our labor unions are going to have to make some sort of concessions. And I've encouraged them to do so. I think from a purely economic standpoint and a humanity standpoint and every other way, we're better off making other concessions rather than laying people off. There are 50 different things that are disastrous in that, in addition to the factor of each family being in a disastrous situation. We have bumping rights, so it means a lot of people wind up in positions that they really shouldn't be in, doing work that they may have done 20 years ago but are very rusty in. We have to pay unemployment benefits. There are a lot of ways that we lose by doing layoffs. And I think if we can find concessions that are relatively modest, some are being proposed now, I think that's the right way to go.
I have a question for Mr. Parks next. Of the decisions that were made in this year's budget, there were reductions in services. What did you feel was the most painful reduction to you personally? Was there a particular thing you didn't want to cut but went ahead and did anyway because of the problems with the budget?
I think any cut is painful, particularly when you know that, particularly the district I represent, that people rely so heavily on city services. Whether you're telling them that you're not going to trim trees or parks are going to have less hours or libraries are going to cut a day. Many people rely on those as a day-to-day activity. They do not have the funds to go out and basically fund it on their own. So each one of those are painful, and the issue is that none of them are taken lightly. But one of the things as far as my goal in dealing with the budget is that often you have to evaluate that there's nothing more important than keeping the city solvent, and that you're jeopardizing 28,000 to 30,000 jobs if you do not make proper decisions on how money is allocated or make proper decisions on reduction of the workforce. Many people often have difficulty, I think, understanding that resources that we have in the city are only there for one purpose, and that is to provide service. So anytime you cut personnel, you're going to have reduction of services. And these are the kinds of things that are going to occur. Across the board, you're going to find in the city of LA that there will be a deterioration of services all the way from public safety to street services to trees to parks and rec to libraries, because you cannot continue at the rate we have gone and maintain the workforce that we have. And I think that, and I disagree somewhat on the sense of the issues that we move forward on, is that yes, there are efficiencies out there, but what you find often in dealing with efficiencies, those dollars that you need as far as cash flow and spending often do not come in a timely fashion for you to make your payroll, for you to be able to balance the budget. And so you need real dollars, you need cash, you need the ability to, it's no different than you making your own monthly bills out. It's just we deal with more zeros. If you do not have a cash flow, if you do not have money in reserve, you cannot survive in the sense of this budget era. But I think the issue that we have to look at is how do we keep the city solvent? How do we not put ourselves in a position to where the city is in bankruptcy and then someone outside of the city is making decisions about where cuts go and just looking at it from the financial point of view as opposed to the service point of view. But again, it's tough. We're certainly not out of the woods at this time. This budget goes into effect July 1st, has over 700 positions that are earmarked to be cut. The issue of that 700 as of June 16th, those pink slips will go out. As people find positions in the special funds or proprietary departments, the number of layoffs can be reduced, but the overall number of positions cut will not be reduced. So it's about 700 plus positions. So every one of those cuts is painful.
Okay. council members. But at a certain point, something changed, and pretty much the whole council kind of decided, no, they're going to keep hiring. That's a dead issue. It's going to stay 9,963 police officers for the next year. And I was wondering, for Councilman Paul Koretz, what changed?
Well, I don't know that anything really changed except, one, the reality. We got a lot of blowback when we started talking about reducing the number of officers. In reality, we talked about not hiring for 2 months, and probably adds up to about 50 officers that we wouldn't have hired out of around 10,000. And we got tremendous angry response to that concept. I don't think there's anything magical. I think the 10,000 figure, the one we're trying to hit, is mostly a PR number. But the fact is, we did already cut the department back substantially, just not in the PR sense, because they were cut back dramatically in terms of the amount of overtime that they did. So in reality, it has the same impact as cutting back a few hundred officers. It just doesn't have the PR impact. So the service impact is the same, the savings is the same, but we have the same number of officers. To make up for that loss, one of the things that Chief Beck has done is he's gotten everybody who is behind a desk and could actually be out in the field. He's reassigned a lot of folks to make up for that difference. So I don't think we're going to see a big loss in service. But if at some point we had to stop hiring and cut back a tiny amount, because so much of our budget is the LAPD, I think they can't always be a sacred cow. Even though public safety is important, even if we had to make a 2% cut to save X number of millions of dollars, I don't think you'd notice it in terms of service, but we'd notice it in terms of being able to meet our budget. The one thing the chief has done in recognition of concerns on the council is he has set up the timing of new classes. So there are some new officers that will be hired in the beginning of the year, then there's a significant gap. So if we really came up short and we did have to decide in working with the chief that we might cut a couple classes and not hire absolutely to attrition, we have that option closer to the end of the year. I think he's handled it well, and so everybody has agreed to go along and move along with this. But it is such a huge piece of the budget. If we don't touch the LAPD budget, we have very little left from which to cut. That's why the rest of these cuts wind up being so draconian.
Okay, great. Here's a question for Wendy Gruhl. You had talked about, in your first answer, about the need to go back to basics. And I was wondering, what are 3 things the city should stop doing?
Well, I think that when you look at some of the services that the city provides, and you look at potentially even the hours that we operate and the consolidation of departments, one of the things that we had, I know I tried as a city council member before, was consolidating some of the departments so that you did not have all the administrative costs associated with, I think we had 32 commissioners for the inclusion of human services, children, youth, and families, I'm trying to think of the other, Human Relations Commission, all separate commissions. And so we combined them during this period of time to be able to reduce, because in some instances you reduce. The council this year looked at not having a separate environmental affairs department and separating that into the various departments, and where you were able to save funds. So I think each year we're, as far as not providing a specific department, it is more looking at some of the services that may not be as quick as you would have had previously. But the core services, again, I go back to it's about streets, it's about trees, it's about it is about sidewalks, and I know that during my tenure we had a 50-50 sidewalk program, which allowed you, if you paid 50% and the city paid 50%, you could expedite paving that no longer exists in the city of Los Angeles to be able to do that.
Is there anything you think going forward the council should look at that it didn't in terms of paring back either response time and some key service?
Well, I think that the council, rightly so, is looking at the costs associated with the pension systems, which is a portion of what we've talked about tonight, and how to look at how many employees going forward. I think for me, when you look at public safety and the fact that the number of officers that we have on the street and having a low crime rate has been an incredible part of the city of Los Angeles. I think when we're looking at the various departments in the city, and potentially which departments that we could look at that would no longer exist, I think that the City Council is looking specifically at every single department. I'm looking at workers' comp. How is the city doing that? I'm looking at contracts that we have in the city of Los Angeles. Believe it or not, some of the contracts where we've gone out, they didn't look at cost effectiveness. They looked just at whether or not it was feasible to do the services in the city of Los Angeles. Every single action that we take has to look at whether or not it's cost effective in the city.
Okay. For Councilman Parks, you mentioned that you're concerned about the pension costs, and I had a couple questions regarding that. How do you propose that the pension costs be decreased? Are you thinking about a ballot measure? Are you thinking about negotiations? And did you support the measure that got the LAPD and the fire department to allow their members to get 90% of their salaries when they retire in the first place? Was that something that you supported when you were chief?
Yeah, I supported the 90%, but before that, as a chief of police, I supported 85% at 35 years. What was interesting, the CAO at that time evaluated it and said it was too cost prohibitive. Within a year, they proposed a 90 and 33. I don't quite understand that logic nor the dollars, and so that went before the public to be voted on. But I think what you have to look at on the pension is this, is that there's certain things that drive the pension system. The size of the workforce drives it, salaries drive it. Also, what is attached in the salary account, that becomes pension related. Our bonuses, a person gets bonuses for certain job activities or for speaking a certain language, are they pension based? You also look at the issue of addressing the return on investment. Annually, the pension fund projects that they're going to get an 8% return on investment. Often they miss that projection. Then it's incumbent on the city to fill that void. So I think you have to go through a number of things. First of all, police fire pensions have to go to the public to vote for the change in the charter. Civilian pensions can be dealt with on ordinance. You have to look at things such as, do you increase the age of the person that's retiring? Do you increase the percentage that they're paying as to their allocation? Do you create a situation that on the down years that the pension investments do not make their 8%? Is there a fluctuating factor that causes employees to pay more? The issue that also drives pensions is the medical plan. Retirees in the city of LA do not pay any into their medical benefits. Do you then increase, at least at this time, the cost of the medical benefits, and do you cause over time a shared cost with the employee in the city as the cost of medical goes up? So there's a variety of things that you can do on medical. It's not a requirement to go to the public to vote on it. It's not a pension vested issue. It can be changed by negotiation and then moving from that to unilateral implementation if you can't get an agreement. There's a lot of things the city can do to make their pension system more viable, because it is absolutely essential for those that are on pension or those who are striving to get a pension to have some viable means in which the pension is there when they are eligible to be pensioned off. To have a situation where in many cities they're only funding 30 or 40% of the pension, that is not a viable pension plan. But the current pension in the city of LA for both sworn and civilians are not sustainable, because as the salary increases, as the bonuses or things that become more pension-based are increased, as you move forward on medical plans, these are all things that will drive the pension increase. It's expected that probably in the next 2 years, the pension cost to the city of LA may approach $1 billion of a $4 billion budget. So that gives you some idea of how critical it is to repair the pension. One thing you have to be aware of, by law and by most court decisions, you can't alter a pension of a person already retired or a person currently in the system unless you give them a like benefit. And so therefore you break even. It's not a cost saving to give a like benefit. But you start off by changing the pension for new employees, which will take some time to take effect. But you can make an immediate impact on medical plans, which again I mentioned earlier, 100% increase in medical plan over the last 10 years.
But I mean, so do you think this means going to the voters when it's the public safety piece? And if you do, how hard is it to convince the voters of that? Do you think it will be a tough sell?
Well, I don't know. The issue is that you have to go to the public to get voted on for police and fire pension. You can't do that any other way. It's in the charter. And so the key is that the public will have to evaluate just where they are as it relates to whether they can sustain from their tax base and the money that they pay into the city system as far as tax dollars in which we then use to pay that fee or that cost. And again, it's going to be an individual vote to where people will say, do we just maintain the stability of the city? Do we maintain the stability of the pension plan? Or do we continue down the path that we've been in the last several years?
If I can add a little something.
Sure.
Just to clarify what Councilmember Park said is correct, that we can't do much of the current pension system. We can primarily do things for future employees. And since we're not looking at doing a lot of hiring in the immediate future, it doesn't resolve our current situation at all. The one place we can resolve it is by dealing with some of the medical costs, but the rest of the pensions, we're essentially stuck with it for the near future, because changing it for new employees really doesn't accomplish much when you're not hiring new employees. You're actually in a mode of laying off. A couple of things we do have to do, as I think was alluded to. Right now we don't have a floor for our contributions. So when we have a really good year and we've made a lot of money in our investments in past years, we said, okay, we won't contribute our share at all. And there really should be a floor. So that in good times, we still contribute our 8% or whatever it would be, so we don't get behind the 8 ball like this in times that aren't so good. There are also some efficiencies that have been looked at for our pension systems. I think it was Laura Chick that did an audit that showed that if we combined our 3 pension systems and all the pieces of it that completely overlap, we could save as much as $500 million over 30 years. And for not losing any services, and not really having to do much except combining very duplicative pieces of that, that's a good amount of savings. So I've been pushing for that so far. The pension systems have been pretty resistant. But for instance, we have pension advisors that give us investment advice, and by and large they've been pretty good, but they've also been pretty equivalent. So each of the 3 systems winds up making about the same amount of money. So why don't they just pick one and get the same advice and not pay for 3 sets of advisors? And that's true throughout the system in various places.
Let me just comment one thing on the pension. Although the new employees will need to take over time to where you get some benefit, the immediate impact on the pension is reducing the workforce, because then you do not have to pay for employees that are not there. So you can make an impact by the reduction of the workforce. For new employees, it will take some 10, 15 years for you to get the benefit of the lower pension costs when you hire.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and I'm going to take questions from the audience. Let's see. I forgot how we're getting the questions to me. Okay, good. So I'm going to ask 2 more, so think of your questions, and then Ron's going to help, I guess, find the person who wants to ask one. So, real quick, I do have another question for Paul Koretz, which is, last year the City Council did vote for early retirement. This got rid of 2,400 people, but there wasn't a whole lot of sense as to what early retirement was going to do to the city. So, a couple months ago, for example, the library department announced that because of early retirement, they lost so many librarians that, bam, they were going to have no more library service on Sundays at their downtown Do you regret doing early retirement, knowing that some of those surprises came along the way in the last few months?
Well, no, I don't think any of them were surprises. We didn't exactly know in which places the disasters would hit, but we knew this would not be a great thing for the city because we were doing early retirements in many cases of the most experienced and capable people that we had on staff. I don't think we had another good choice. Had we not done the early retirements and the transfers from general funded to special funded positions, we would have either had to have laid off 3,000 people, and instead of having those people living on their pensions, they would be taking unemployment, we'd be destroying those families, we'd be contributing negatively to LA's economy, we'd be bumping 3,000 people into odd jobs. I think it was by far the more humane and cost-effective way to go. But we knew there'd be a negative impact. You can't just have 2,400 of your most experienced people leave and not have that. One of the things we have done for absolute emergencies where we really need to know the information, institutional information that only those people had, we do have 90-day contracts. So those people can come back exactly when we need them to advise us on a project or how to do something that no one in a department knows how to do anymore. And people are willing to come back and do that. So we haven't completely lost those people. It's been unfortunate, and from my perspective, in a way we're looking at doing the worst combination, where we early retired many of our best and most experienced people, and now we're looking at laying off generally some of our youngest and most enthusiastic newcomers. So we're losing both the energy and the expertise. I particularly fought hard against the layoff piece of that, which I think is more disastrous economically and is taking the energy out of a lot of our workforce. Hopefully we don't wind up even doing the 700 layoffs that we're talking about.
And this question is for City Controller Gruhl. Just up the street from City Hall is the County Hall of Administration, where there are considerably fewer job cuts going on there right now. And I'm wondering, do you think there are things that they're doing better over at the county than they are at the city budget-wise? And if so, what?
I'm not as intricately involved in their budget. I think they have talked about some layoffs this year. I think one of the things they have done well, which is something that Mr. Parks and I advocated over the years, was having a healthy reserve fund that they're able to do. They are greatly impacted by the state budget cuts, so you will see this year, I think, a change in their area. It is easier to have 5 people versus 15 and make decisions, I must admit. Don't you think, Parks? Wouldn't you just like 5 people on the budget committee? Not on the budget committee.
For the council, it is more difficult.
There's more. But I think that for the county, they have done some good things, but they also have had some major problems as well. And it's kind of a little bit of apples and oranges. But I think, as I've indicated, that the important part is ensuring that we do have a strong reserve fund and the ability to deal with any potential crisis. Because as we saw in this last couple of months, even though the DVP is now transferring the $73 million, there was a point in time in which they were not transferring the $73 million, which we did not have a judgment obligation bond, and the potential of us going down to zero in our reserve fund would not have given us the kind of flexibility that the city needs to be able to pay our bills. We use the example of, if you are someone who now has $1 million in your checking account and you're not really, you don't have to balance your checkbook because you have $1 million in your checking account. That's how the city was operating. They had enough money to get them through each time, and suddenly the city has to balance their checkbook, and it's very, very important. One thing, if I could just say, David, because you asked me on some of the departments, one of the ideas that we've had is looking at the convention center, for example. Certain things the city doesn't do well. We should not be operating a convention center that should be much more flexible and ability to engage people to come into the city of Los Angeles. There are discussions about some of the departments and whether they should be privatized or not, or a public-private partnership, more importantly, to ensure that we look at some of the things like our parking structures. It's another area where we lose money in a number of our parking structures and instead should be able to get some of that benefit from So we have to think outside the box in some of those areas, because again, there are some things we do well and other things we just don't do well.
Can I point out one thing with the county?
Sure.
You might remember a little over a decade ago, the county healthcare system almost collapsed. So they've had their bad times as well. In fact, the only reason that it remained solvent was that Bill Clinton was president and bailed the system out with X number of millions of dollars. I think having gone through that period, I think they've been fiscally more careful and built up more of a reserve. And I'd point out that in the previous time I was a council member in the city of West Hollywood, we had a very substantial reserve. We went through down economic times in the early 90s and struggled through that, and our city manager and council decided after that we would put aside a significant amount of money every single year so that we never ran into that trouble again. And while everybody else is struggling, the city of West Hollywood is embarking on its capital improvement plan, building various buildings on city properties and in West Hollywood Park, because they're not anywhere close to being in danger. And really that's what the city of Los Angeles needs to do. We need to set aside not a 3 to 5% surplus, but we need to set that aside every single year as part of the budget in the better times. So that instead of having a 3% reserve, at some point we have a 20 or 25% reserve. And then we hit a couple of years like this, we wouldn't have to break a sweat. And that's really where the city should leave itself.
Okay, so do people have questions for Rob Galbraith?
I didn't know the questions were for me.
Yes.
Okay, Paul Resnick.
Paul Resnick, West Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. Over the last several years, the city's credit rating has been downgraded. And for any normal institution, that would mean higher interest rates on debt. I haven't heard anything this evening about this. And I'd like to know what percent of the city's budget is allocated to debt service.
First of all, the city was downgraded over the last year. Up until the $200 million shortfall, the city was running with a AAA rating. It is expensive to borrow money with a lower rating, and we will experience that come July when we go out to what we call our trans, which is about $600 to $1 billion worth of loan that we will get for cash flow and also to pay our pension costs. I don't have a number for you as to how much is involved with debt service, because basically the city has a debt policy that we do not carry more than 5% to 6% debt based on our general fund. And so we are well under that 5 to 6%, but that's the maximum debt that we can carry.
Anyone else want to field that pop quiz before we move on?
No, I mean, I think it is, you know, when you do look at your borrowing, because most of the revenue that we get in the city of Los Angeles comes later in our fiscal year. So property tax, which is a large portion, even our sales tax, which after the holiday season we get a greater amount. Business tax that comes forward, that doesn't come until after the beginning of the calendar year. And so historically we do have to borrow in July to cover those early expenses and pay it back during that year period of time.
Yes, I'm trying to remember something I read in the LA Times, maybe something you wrote.
What's your name?
I'm Don Silver. If there are layoffs of 700, has the city entered into an agreement with the unions that 15,000 other employees get 2-3% raises? Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, you are right, and the unions aren't looking forward to those raises. Those raises, I think, were designed to be protections from those layoffs. We agreed to that in exchange for our employees to give back, I believe it was around $80 million last year in concessions, which is very dramatic. But that's one of many reasons why I think laying off 700 people doesn't make sense, because a good chunk of that would be offset by the fact that we wind up having to give back almost $30 million to the unions in this coalition for raises that they don't really want. So at least this year, much of those layoffs don't wind up resulting in savings. When you look at that, plus bumping, plus unemployment, plus other things, I think we get almost nothing from it this year. So it really doesn't resolve the situation from my perspective. I think we're better off looking for a combination of efficiencies and concessions from the unions and not winding up having to do the layoffs.
I think if, I disagree a little bit, is that somewhere around 300 to 320 layoffs is the balancing point as to whether it's cost effective or not. And also, when we use the term layoffs, it's more appropriate to say that there's 700 positions that will be cut, of which some might be laid off. It's not 700 people getting a pink slip to leave the door. And so I think we have to, that's why that number is very, very fluid. But it is a major, if you go back and look at the statistics and the dollars, it is depending on how large the number gets as far as loss of positions and whatever number of layoffs are in there, you will find it is a tremendous financial windfall for the city to lay people off because you get the benefit of pension, workers' comp, medical, and even though you may have to pay them their delayed retroactive cost of living, and you may have to pay them the cost of unemployment, as that number progresses over 320, you will find a significant windfall of dollars to the benefit of the city.
So if I could just point out one more thing on that, and you should recognize this is sort of an ongoing debate because Councilmember Parks and I are sort of the extreme ends of the council on this issue. To be honest, from my perspective, you lose the services that 700 people would provide, but you get the savings of laying off a little over 300 people. That's certainly my definition of a lose-lose situation for the people of Los Angeles. The service loss of 700 employees will be dramatically felt by the residents of the city.
But I think you also realize that if you can't afford 700 employees, the dramatic loss of a solvent city is significant. And so if you can't afford them, then you have to make decisions as it relates to either cutting the positions or reducing the workforce. So it's wonderful to say that you lose service, but every time you cut an employee, you're losing service. And so it's what we're in business to do. And if you don't cut the workforce, you can't afford it, and then you will be in a real tough situation as time moves forward of being able to sustain a pension fund, medical costs, workers' comp, and a workforce that you do not have the funds for.
Can I just stop real quick and point out before we go to our next question here? There was a story in the LA Times about a group of council members that I've called the budget hawks and a group called the budget doves. You're watching it play out in real time. Although you're always welcome to go back and read my story. So let's see if Ron has another question.
Well, actually, I've got a follow-up on this because we've got two different perspectives, one from Councilmember Goretz, one from Councilmember Parks. So, Controller Gruhl, do you want to weigh in on this too?
Yeah, whose side are you on?
Whose side are you on? Tell us now.
Well, I'm not going to pick a side necessarily, but as a controller, I want to make sure I have enough money in my budget to be able to pay my bills, and that's the important part of it. And so you have to look at the cost-benefit ratio. And I have been a conservative in the fact that we cannot go forward unless we have the money in the bank. And it's why at the time that I indicated we had to take money from our reserve fund to pay our bills. That's just not sustainable going forward. We have to look not just at the short term, but looking at the long term. And so unless we can afford to have that number of employees, we have to look at other ways to cut.
Okay, we're going to take a question in the front row and then move over to that side for a few moments.
I'm deaf myself, and I have a sign language interpreter, and I also have a dog that's a signing dog. And what happened is one afternoon, I went to Vaughn's, and I went to buy some food, and my dog is a licensed hearing dog. And I saw two men with a pit bull dog, and they were standing kind of by the side wall, and I was walking with my dog, and I wanted to avoid them, but what happened is the pit bull ran and he grabbed my dog. He got loose, he grabbed my dog, he grabbed him on the neck, and his teeth were biting into my dog, and my dog almost died. and 5 or 6 people came over. They tried to grab and save my dog and pull the other dog off. And so what happened, the shopping center, the security, they called 911, the emergency, and then the other people that were standing around also called 911. And so like about 5 people called 911 to come. And it was serious because the dog had been bitten, I had been bitten, but the police did not show up for more than 2 hours. Nobody showed up because there's not enough police force to show up. And so it was a terrible situation that the dog was sick and the dog had all these problems and there was nobody. And then I had to go to the vet and get medication for him and the police.
One more question. Do you have another question?
Yeah, I need your help to get a faster response from the police force so that they can help my dog. And so the dog was dangerous, the pit bull, and I need to get help right now because there's not enough police with 911. So why not? Why aren't there not enough? I mean, what are you going to do because there's not enough police?
So this is a question about both police hiring and response times. Are there enough police and are response times fast enough? And if they're not, do you see any change in the future?
Let me just comment on that. This is one of my favorite subjects. One of the things, first of all, we have the largest police department in the history of the city of Los Angeles. So if you have the largest department that's deployed and there's a view that there's not enough police officers, I think there's then the step you have to go forward and determine then how are they deployed. And if you look at how they're deployed and look at officers working 3 days a week and 4 days a week, you lose considerable amount of resources by the shifts that they work. And if you also, this is where we talk about the police department becoming, deteriorating their services, to cut civilian employees in deference to hiring sworn employees, eventually the city of LA will begin to see the deterioration of sworn workforce. It is no different in the fire department. If you cut their civilian mechanics, sworn firefighters will not be able to drive those trucks, fix those trucks, fix their radios, fix their computers, get those trucks and paramedic wagons on the street. Police department's in the same boat. If you cut 300 civilians out of the police department, who's going to process their paperwork? Who's going to analyze their crimes? Who's going to take the photographs? Who's going to prepare the reports to go to the district attorney, city attorney? So a loss of civilians in the police workforce is significant. And then if you look at the budget and realize that 1.45 million hours of overtime that was paid in the police department, roughly about $100 million, has been reduced to somewhere around 6 or 7 million. Those officers now, in addition to working 3 and 4 days a week, now can only accumulate 200 hours of overtime, and then they must be sent home. So you're paying a larger amount for 9633 on officers, getting back in return significantly less hours on the street and their deployment. And so that's what you'll see under this whole issue of cutting civilians, hiring police officers, and not looking at the balance that you need.
So we have another question.
Just to add something, I think it is important to note that we're not hiring new officers above our current number. We're just hiring to attrition, so that on average, I think it's about 200 and maybe it's more, 220, 240 officers each year retire. And so I've been of the position that we have to keep at least to the number that we have had to be able to have those officers on the street. And Chief Beck has done a great job. I think Paul mentioned this, but as well, and I think you would agree, Mr. Parks, he's trying to get more officers out on the street and really looked at the deployment and how important that is in the city of Los Angeles, so we don't have them sitting behind a desk. And he would agree in the fact that once more civilians that can process it, we shouldn't have police officers having to sit behind a desk. That should be civilian positions.
And if I could just add one other thing, which is, in fairness, our crime rate is the lowest I think it's been in over 50 years. This is a very effectively run department, and this kind of complaint used to be more common. I don't think I've actually gotten a complaint to my office, and I've been in office almost a year, of really slow response on an emergency call to 911. Sometimes the response is slow to come and take a report a few hours later, but it's rare that there's a crime in progress or an emergency that the fire department has to handle, and it isn't handled very quickly. So I would assume this is an anomaly. I'd like to think so. And the other piece of your issue, which is pit bulls, has been a problem for a number of years. This is a complaint that you hear every few months, that a pit bull attacks somebody else's dog and kills it or injures it, or even people. And what to do about it has been a thorny problem. I know there are some cities that have considered, but I don't know that any of them have implemented an actual ban on pit bulls. The problem is they can be physically dangerous, but the problem is generally with the owner more than the dog, and it's the kind of training and oversight they get. So people generally react negatively to the idea of banning all pit bulls, because some of them are perfectly nice dogs and well-trained and not a threat. So I'm not sure we have an answer for that piece, even though it's been discussed for years.
Let's have another question.
Great. And we've got a whole bunch of people with questions, so if we can keep the questions and the responses quick. I know you have one follow-up, Councilman Parks.
When we talk about deployment and we talk about response, it just depends on what part of the city you're in. It is a daily occurrence in the 8th and the 9th district about slow response. And it just happens to be the #1 and 2 areas in the city that have the highest crime rate, the highest violence rate. But the complaint routinely is lack of response, slow response, and also the fact that you find that there is very little visible patrol other than seeing people driving fast to the next call. And so in certain parts of the city, it is not an anomaly.
Thank you. What's your name?
Hello, my name is Lenore Brooks. I'm living in this area now for 32 years. I would like to say that I do not think that you guys are efficient. The contracts that you negotiated with SCIU and all these other unions turned out to be very much for the employer, for the employee, and not for the city. We are the city. We pay taxes. We pay a great deal of taxes. In fact, the sales tax is 10%. When I have to buy something, I go outside of the city of Los Angeles. Los Angeles
Is there a question?
not friendly to business people, and that's why we're having the problem. But one other issue that you've been skirting around all evening is
Ask a question,
you
please.
have illegals. What are you doing about the illegals that are costing this city so much money?
Let me just say
Who'd like to take that?
Let me just say on the legal issue, that is a very appropriate question when you talk to your congressional leaders.
Very what?
Very appropriate question when you talk to your congressional leaders. There's little or no authority on a local level to deal with immigration. And so that is a federal question, and clearly I think many people agree.
Is it okay for the illegals to go
I'm not
around
gonna get into that.
every
Just
place and go
giving
into
you
the
If you can please give the council member an opportunity to speak.
Take out the recyclables that the city is supposed to
Let me just say
put
this,
money on?
it's a federal issue, and I think most people agree you need an overhaul of the immigration system in the United States.
Gary, if I could just say one thing, the one thing that I was involved with, and I think LA could do a little more with, is dealing with the underground economy. Because a lot of people are hired and are mostly illegal, paid less than minimum wage, sometimes not paid at all, and taken advantage of, but it's because we allow it. We don't go after the employers who are breaking all kinds of labor laws.
The employers are right on this floor. They're all sitting here. They are the gardeners, they are the maids, they are the servants. Everyone is responsible. You're all paid.
Ma'am, you had your shot.
I think we've got a couple of other questions here.
My question is for anybody that can answer it up there. When the budget first came out and the cuts were announced, the parks were going to be closed or the people who ran the parks were going to be let go, from what I understood. And to me, those people are first responders. If we have a disaster of any kind, then to me we're in trouble because nobody will be there to unlock the facilities to give us access wherever we need. Is that still true, that those people are being let go?
I think of the parks, probably the #1 group that's going to be let go are the child care. You'll find that there's going to be a compression of hours to where they'll be looking at parks on a regional basis or a cluster. So you will not find every service at every park. But yes, there will be a reduction in overall hours and services at parks, libraries. Every part of the city will experience some deterioration of service.
So the person that is unlocking that building.
Well, I don't know what their jobs are. I'm just saying the people that are assigned to Park and Recreation are going to have a deterioration of services. Now, whether it's the person that unlocks the door, or if it's the person that cleans up the park, or it's the person that runs the program, there's going to be a deterioration of services.
Yeah, if I could mention one thing too that I'm hoping will reduce that a little bit is in the past we've had a policy that you can contribute to a library foundation or a parks foundation to contribute hardscape like benches, but you couldn't contribute the salaries. And I've pushed, and we're in the process of changing that so that if a Friends of the Library group wants to help cover the cost of some of their employees and keep the hours open longer, keep them from layoffs, they will now be able to contribute towards that. And the same thing with the parks. I'm also hoping that we can seek some both corporate and philanthropic donors, and again, ask them to do the same thing, to contribute towards actual salaries so that we can reduce some of the layoffs and keep our hours longer.
Okay, next question.
Yeah.
Brian McComb. I'd say probably the one word you've heard most the last hour or so is the word pension. Myself and virtually everybody I know takes responsibility, funds their 401k, manages it, takes care of it, or Keel accounts. I'd love to hear each of your thoughts in 2 or 3 sentences would be fine. Thoughts of eliminating the pension and making the county employees responsible for their own retirements.
Let me say this, that's been discussed, and there is absolutely no support for that. I'm very honest with you. No, it's employees. Well, first of all, if you look at why government employees have pensions, is that...
This is the debate.
If you could just get an opportunity to the council member.
The pension plans that are in place has been discussed for the last several years. There is no support for going away from, and I forget, defined benefit or whatever the term is, and going to a 401k. There are employees that are able to do deferred comp in addition, but they do not, there is no support to altering the current plan.
Well,
Thank you.
This is not a debate.
My wife only went through 4 bankruptcies at Continental, and she has no pension, so it doesn't quite work.
We've got a question about sidewalks.
We've heard that the city may transfer financial responsibility for repairing the sidewalks to homeowners. At the same time, people are not allowed to touch the trees, otherwise they get a $1,000 fine. And the trees are city trees. There's also been some discussion that liability for injuries on sidewalks would be transferred or at least shared by the homeowner, even though it's not homeowner property. Can you tell us where this stands and how you're going to handle the various problems that would be
Glad to explain so we can clarify and get the right information out. First of all, in 1911, and I won't go through each year, but since 1911, there's a state law that made sidewalks, trees, and parkway the property of the adjoining property owner. It wasn't until 73, 74, when the city of LA received some federal money, that they took on the responsibility of sidewalks that were damaged by trees. And with that, after 2 years, that money dissipated. The city has continued to hold that responsibility without the funds to fix the sidewalks. Even though you must have a permit to cut a tree down and to replant one, it is still your tree. The trees, the bulk of the trees in the city of LA were planted by the developer that built the residents. And so trees, parkways, and sidewalks are the responsibility, and has always been in the state of since 1911, the responsibility of the property owner, except the narrow slice of trees that broke up sidewalks, generally in residential areas. What the plan is to move the city back to previous 1973, but also allow, as you move forward, to have the trees clearly have always been the ownership of the property owner. And you do have the ability to alter the tree if you get a permit, but also to move forward on understanding that in a right-of-way, whether it's sidewalks or streets, it will always be the city's responsibility for any injury in a right-of-way. The responsibility of the adjoining property owner is for the repair of the sidewalk. And if you get noticed, just like the city, and do not repair the sidewalk, then you could be liable for some of the injury if someone should trip and fall. So that's a thumbnail sketch of about 6 years of work in the council to get us to this point.
We're generally not taking follow-ups, except it's hard to say no to the president of the organization that's sponsoring it. So here you go.
And I threatened him. I'm concerned about the regressive nature of the policy. If you have a house that's worth $2.5 million, repairing the sidewalk is a fairly small percentage of the value of the home. But if your home is worth $100,000, it becomes incredibly burdensome. Will the policy be applied equally throughout the city, or will there be different considerations based on different parts of the city? And if so, we're interested, I think, in how our area might be impacted.
Well, let me say that, it's really regressive is that sidewalks that are broken and not fixed. And so the issue is getting the sidewalks fixed. In the last 7 years, the city spent almost $95 million on sidewalks, repaired about 500 miles of sidewalk. There's still 4,000 miles of sidewalks that are in disrepair. Now, at the rate the city's going, they roughly estimate there's 83 years of sidewalk repair left to be done. Now, we can quibble over who fixes them. The key is, do they get fixed? And it is no less important in a $200,000 house or a $6 million house that the sidewalks are fixed for people to use it for the right-of-way, the purpose is set up to be. And so it's a matter of fixing the sidewalks so that we do not have unnecessary injuries. The city puts out somewhere between $4 and $5 million a year in payouts for trips and falls.
I believe the city controller also wants to speak on this.
Well, only because as a council member, it was a big issue for me, and it's why as I mentioned earlier, we started the 50-50 sidewalk program, because when the head of street services said it would be 85 years and $1 billion before we could fix all the sidewalks, he was aware of that we're broken in the city. I said, we have to do something different than what we're doing, because we won't make a dent in this kind of effort across the city. So in the 50-50 sidewalk program, we were able to expand the number of miles by 20% alone in my district, but we also used community development block grant dollars, federal dollars that could be used in lower income neighborhoods to help repair those sidewalks in areas where they may not be able to do the 50-50 sidewalk program, because I thought it was critically important. I am hoping that as we go forward in the city and we are able to see additional revenues, and we look at potentially having that 50-50 sidewalk program again, because it was very effective and allowed us to stretch our dollars. There are some suggestions that are being debated out there as to whether or not you use it as a point of sale. So for example, if you sell your home, you make it as part of that escrow, having to fix the sidewalk as part of that point of sale, and potentially have it over a number of years, that you would be able to depreciate the cost of doing that at the time. But that's still being debated in the council.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, if you're lucky, I
if
have
I
no
could add one
sidewalks.
thing also, just briefly, this has been part of the ongoing budget debate too, whether we make structural changes and decide to solve our financial problem not just now, but ongoing, by saying fixing sidewalks isn't our core mission as a city. Trimming trees is not our core mission as a city. So really the discussion hasn't been that we're just going to stop doing it for a year or two. The discussion, which I've objected to, has been we're deciding certain services are going to be things the city gets out of the business of doing. And so when we lay people off, they're going to stay laid off, and those services are not going to return. And that's something that I've objected to from the very beginning.
I see more hands, so let's see some
Okay,
questions.
we've got a question here. A quick one.
My name is Don Parker, and first of all, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here for coming out. I think we're grateful that you're facing the lions and tigers and bears of the audience. Here's my question. I read about all the things about the budget, and I look at the economics of both our city and the country and see what's going on. What are your feelings about the city in terms of, do you think there's a chance it will ever declare bankruptcy? If so, when? If not, why not?
Let's start with Paul and work the other way this time.
I think there's no reason for us to declare bankruptcy. We would almost have to proactively work at it to get to that point. I mean, we have to do some things that I don't want to do, but we could do, like the number of layoffs that we're talking about. I absolutely think that's a last choice, and I think we can avoid it. But we would do that before we declare bankruptcy. We would stop providing certain services that we've decided are the lowest priority. And even though I might not want to stop providing them, even I agree they're lower priority than the next group of priorities, like public safety and emergency services and such. So we would do things like that, things that we all consider draconian before we would declare bankruptcy. I don't think we're near that. I think had we not done the early retirements and the special fund transfers, and were we still carrying an additional 3,000 employees, we would put ourselves in closer danger to that. But I think having taken that step, I don't think we're in danger of going bankrupt.
We'll stop and the next person comes.
We've got a question from Mr. Sullivan over here. Here you go.
Jim O'Sullivan, just clarification. Furloughs. If I remember somewhere during the process, the city was talking about furloughing every worker 26 days. That somehow came up as a way of dealing with the $489 million. But the law, there's a state lawsuit, and it says you can't do that. And I think it's going to the California Supreme Court, but not until July 7th to start hearing this case. Since the new budget starts July 1st, is there a plan B on any furloughs if it is deemed that they're illegal? Will they then have to go to layoffs? Because you're talking about a lot of hours if ever you're talking about 26.
Bernard Clark, is there a plan B?
First of all, the court case is going to that you're referring to deals with furloughs on special fund positions, not on general fund. And so the key is that we feel very certain, as much as we can, that the issue of layoffs and furloughs as we are moving forward are legal, and that we feel certain that the furloughs, as long as they're not special funded positions, we're in good legal stead. Now, realize the difference between layoffs and furloughs. Furlough gives you a 1-year benefit of accumulating salary. You still pay the pension and the medical. Furloughs basically is a one-shot deal, unless you buy into having furloughs every year. The layoffs basically solve several issues: the workforce, the pension, the medical, and the workers' comp.
Go for it.
I just wanted to respond on the bankruptcy because I was asked a lot about that as a city controller, and my response has been that it would be a cop-out for the city to go bankrupt because we would be told by the judge to make some of the same difficult decisions. The mayor and council would be told to make the same decisions they could make today. So I think that we cannot let someone else make those choices. It has to be done by the city of Los Angeles, and it all costs to avoid bankruptcy by making those difficult choices.
Oh, sure.
Let me just comment on bankruptcy. I think it's well within the purview of the city, depending on how good their decisions are. But I think the two key factors that I look at, and that I think everyone else should look at, is that come October and January, if we hit another skid of a couple $100 million shortfall, that is something that you may not be able to recover from. The city has had a great history of pulling back its expenditures and not spending money. We have not done well as it relates to funds that do not come in. So if you have 2 successive years in which your projections on revenue are a couple $100 million short, that is a very critical time come October or January to determine whether the city can continue with its current workforce size and its other obligatory expenses.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Rockenkamp. I live in Cheviot Hills. I had a follow-up question to the gentleman who was sitting over here when he was talking about moving from a defined benefit structure to a defined contribution structure. And what I'm trying to figure out is how to reconcile your comment that you don't support that move with what I've been hearing all night is that the current pension structure is not sustainable. So what meaningful and material concessions are you looking for to change it so it's sustainable long term?
Oh, I actually didn't hear Mr. Park say he didn't support it. He said there is no support on the council, which I think is probably true. What we can do is change many of the parameters. I mean, for instance, right now, if certain elements of our workforce are eligible for retirement at age 50, well, that, in many eyes, probably including my own, is a little bit too generous. So maybe for new hires, it winds up being 60. For employees now, I believe your pension is based, I believe, on your highest salaried year. In other places, it may be your 3 highest salaried years. So that if your salary went up in the last year, it's not only based on that year, so your pension would be a little less. There are a lot of those kinds of changes that we can make without throwing out the whole system. The system, by and large, has worked well for employees because the investment that the systems have done, except in this one crash, have been pretty effective. Actually, they've been good money managers. Employees that are left to their own devices often don't do as well. So I think we'd be better off reducing the richness of the benefits than throwing the employees out to their own devices.
We've got a question about cellular phones and income for the city.
My name is Lucy Bob. I'm also a resident of Cheviot Hills, and I think we have a public safety issue that is not being addressed by the city, by the police, that could raise a great deal of revenue for the city and prevent the accidents that we see as a result of illegal cell phone use. Nobody's talking about it. I understand why. I know you have other issues on your plate, but every citizen in the city of Los Angeles is being impacted by the illegal and very dangerous use of cellular phones in moving vehicles. It's tantamount to drunk driving, and yet the fines are very low and very non-punitive. If the fines were if the fines were raised significantly, I think the city would benefit financially, and those of us that are in our cars and pedestrians would also benefit.
Yes, I would agree with you. I supported Joe Smithian on the state is the one who actually put the initial legislation in the first year no one would pass it. And then there was several instances of people getting in accidents and texting and added texting in the next year very quickly. It is a state law, correct me if I'm wrong, Bernard, but I don't think we get a portion of those. It's set by the state as to the amount that particular item has. I think it might be a discussion on the state level, but you are completely right. For the first few months that the law came into effect, people were abiding by it. But now, I think the most interesting, and I'm going to steal Bernard's phone, the most interesting you see now, people, is they don't hold it to the ear, but they hold it here. They think this is not breaking the law, and they're talking like this, and they're driving and using only one hand. So I think it is something that continue a campaign to do that.
So just one more thing on that for 1 second. and I was one of the co-authors of submitting this legislation when I was there. I know people who've gotten tickets, so our folks are writing the tickets. I think there's $75, and I think the state winds up with virtually all of it. And if we got $1 once in a while as a piece of it, it certainly doesn't help us much. Now, what I'm not sure of is whether we can tack anything onto that. If we could, it wouldn't be the worst idea. And I know Mr. Parks doesn't even know whether we can or not, but certainly if we have the ability to do that, I don't know why we wouldn't tack on an extra $50 and keep it and enforce one of our greater safety dangers.
Since we have a whole bunch of questions and very little time left, I'm going to ask everybody to limit their questions to no more than 30 seconds and one person to answer them. This is going to be sort of like the fire round of questions. So go for it.
Okay, my name is Marilyn Culbertson, and I have a question. I'm hearing a lot about a lot of employees being released, and I'm asking how many supervisory or administrative employees are also either going to lower level jobs or making concessions in their salaries.
Okay, who's the one that wants to take that answer?
I think you find that the people that are being, first of all, early retired, are being released are across the board. In fact, many supervisors have had to reduce their rank in order to fit into the category for them to remain employed. And so it's not a situation that only a certain level of people are being laid off. Across the board, you find that positions that are viewed as unnecessary or have those cuts, you make those cuts. And so, again, when you talk about layoffs, remember, it's positions being cut, some of which may be layoffs. And if you remove 3,500 positions that you were paying, you had allocated full cost on those positions, you've served the same purpose of recovering those funds back into the city treasury. So it's across the board. It's not dedicated to just one group.
Okay, we're still in the lightning round, so make it quick.
The question is for Wendy. I'm Steve Twining, she knows me. How much is in the reserve fund today for the end of June? And the second question is DWP. There's been no mention of our significant increase in rates already and the forecast for the future.
We have the reserve fund. I think the last amount I saw was $122 million. I think it was about $122 million in our reserve fund. 5% this last year was $220 million that we would have had. We have two parts of the reserve fund. We have the emergency reserve and the contingency reserve. If you get below $120 million in this year, you're dipping into your emergency reserve, which we were very concerned about. When I asked the council for $80 million, actually I asked for 90, and we agreed to 80 million that we had to take out of the reserve fund at the time, it got us dangerously close to that amount of money. Next year, they're putting in also $122 million, which is 3%, and if they bring it up over the year, that would go up to, my hope, and we've asked for, a 5%. On the DWP, I'm currently doing an audit, a very quick audit on the Department of Water and Power and their ability to have transferred that $73 million. As you may have noticed in the paper, many articles in which Mr. Zeinhauser here wrote about was whether or not they had the money to transfer that $73 million if the council did not increase the ECAF in the city. And the report hopefully will be out in 7 to 10 days, which we're looking at the Department of Water and Power. There's a lot of mistrust of the Department of Water and Power and their transparency, and it's my hope as a city controller to be able to shine a little light on them.
This will be the last one, by the way, Mr.
Yes, this is going to be the last one, and you are the lucky one here, so you better make it good. But I understand that everybody up at the dais has agreed to stay till 2 o'clock in the morning to answer all questions. Is that right? Right after this? Here we go.
My name is Miranda Stockwell, and I'm an early childhood teacher. I have read and heard that all of the city's park and recreation early childhood centers will be closed, all but 2. What is the thinking when we have most of our children we know that most of our children will go on through school and finish high school having had this early start? And also, what about these parents who are working and need these centers in order to have their children so that they can work?
I think it fits into the overall budget cuts, and that whether providing childcare, and although we all agree that childcare is important and that it's probably the less money we spend on crime prevention, it's a matter of whether the city could continue to maintain and subsidize childcare when the people that are using it are not paying a full cost recovery. And that's how these issues came about in looking at that particular function as cutting back. But also, Rec and Park was given the task that during this budget year for them to look at getting a private partnership with people that can come in and reestablish child care in the facilities that are already present at the Park and Rec facilities.
Thank you very much. I have one last question, which actually a number of people have asked me about, and one that's sort of a burning question for me too. And that is, with whom does the buck stop when all is said and done when it comes to budget issues and to collections? What's interesting is there are amazing audits that are done by the Controller's Office, and yet the Controller cannot necessarily enforce what each of those departments does or doesn't do thereafter. You can shine a great light on it, but it's hard to enforce. You've got the Budget and Finance Committee, you've got the CAO, you've got the Office of Finance, all these different entities out there. And when it comes to the budget and when it comes to collections, with whom does the buck really stop? And is there a way to create a better system?
You know, one of the things we're going to work on this year is to implement many of the recommendations of the Macias report that talks about centralizing the recovery of funds in the city. And that's something I think will enhance our ability. Currently, it's decentralized amongst the departments, and I believe we'll get a much better return. But one of the things I think you have to be aware of is that many of the figures that's reported as revenue that is not collected, much of it is uncollectible, and particularly when it deals with paramedic charges, by the fact that you have Medicare, Medi-Cal, and Medicare that do not allow you to collect certain dollars. The other issue on traffic citations, it's a matter of they collect something like 85% of all violation money. That's about a 15% that's uncollectible because cars get transferred and things. So that dollar figure often is basically significantly higher than what actually can be collected. But it's still a lot of work to be done.
I just want to add, as the City Controller's Office, we're doing an audit, follow-up audit on a collection report that was done by the City Controller and should be released in the next couple of weeks, which looks at how well we're doing, how we can improve in certain areas. And the Macias report that Mr. Parks talks about is a report that was requested by the Office of Finance to look and see if we could consolidate, because right now we have various departments that are doing their own collections, some in which that send out to collection agencies at different times. There isn't a coordinated approach, and we think it's critically important. And on the audit front, as the City Controller and I did a study right after we were sworn in that showed that 46% of the audits that had been done by the City Controller had not been heard by the City Council at the time, and that we are looking and holding accountable that the items are actually being implemented. You can go to our website and look at some of the audits, and we will be having a scorecard that will show those items that the departments have been able to implement, those that are still pending in the City Council or need signature by the mayor, so you can know where we are in the status of each of those.
Yeah, and if I can answer that also, I think the buck really stops at the council level for virtually everything. And in terms of efficiencies, there have been a lot of audits that were ignored, particularly during Laura Chick's years, where she had a lot of brilliant ideas, and many of them, if not most of them, weren't followed up. As chair of the Audits and Government Efficiency Committee, we're trying to make sure some of the things go right to the bureaucracy and get handled. When an audit has some obvious answers, some of them they just ignore. And we're trying to make sure we hear as many of those audits as possible, and where there's something obvious that is a great idea and a great efficiency, and the city bureaucracy isn't implementing it, we'll do motions to make sure that happens. And a lot of those ideas also went through the budget process, and we tried to capture those and get those agreed to by city management and the city bureaucracy. So those are being implemented as well. But that's part of what I consider my mission, is to make sure that all those good ideas for efficiencies are carried out. Because in past years, there were a lot of things people knew about, talked about, never went anywhere. And we're way past having the good fortune that we could ignore those, not that we ever should have, but we're not in a financial position to ignore any savings anymore.
It is now 9:30. I want to thank our panel, Councilmember Parks, good for the roll. Thank you all for coming. Thank all of you for coming. And I think with that, our meeting
Thank Ron
will
Galper
adjourn.
for helping us get through so many questions.
Yes, Ron, definitely. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.